The Vampire King's Love. Chapter 3. Igor gazed at the moonlit courtyard from the highest balcony of his ancestral estate. It had been several days since Lilith's defeat, and a calm hush had settled over every corridor, every chamber. The vampire guards moved quietly through the halls, their footsteps soft against marble floors. Evon found herself savoring that peace, relieved to think that perhaps at last they could leave danger behind. She often watched Igor from a distance, marveling at how his solemn demeanor seemed to ease whenever he looked her way. Though his power still emanated from him like the aura of a king, his eyes would soften whenever she entered the room, and for a while, they lived in the semblance of tranquility. Sometimes they strolled hand in hand through the garden at dusk, or she sang softly in the music room while Igor listened in reverent silence. She cherished these moments, believing they had turned the page from terror to hope. Yet she could not shake a faint unease that lingered in the air, as though the shadows of Igor's past still watched them from just beyond the torchlight. She tried not to dwell on those shadows, focusing instead on the joy of simply being together. Each evening, when the stars emerged, Igor would join her on the ornate balcony. They would talk in low voices about anything and everything. Her old life, before she had met him, his centuries of solitude, the trials they had already faced. He often reached out to tuck a stray lock of her hair behind her ear, and she would lean into his touch, grateful that, against all odds, they had found each other. Although the bruises and nightmares of Lilith's attack were still fresh, Evon's spirit began to mend. She saw a gentleness in Igor that he shared with no one else. He had devoted himself to her protection, and every time he laced their fingers together, she felt safe. One night, as the sky darkened to a velvety blue, Igor stood by a gilded window, gazing into the distance. Evon noticed the tension in his shoulders. She approached him, resting her hand on his back, feeling the muscles there coil like taut wires. "What is it?" she asked gently. He closed his eyes as though gathering the courage to speak. "Nothing," he answered, but his voice wavered. She frowned, unsure whether to press him for more. Finally, he sighed and turned to her, placing both hands on her shoulders. "I'm sorry. I'm just a little on edge." She sensed there was more to it, but decided not to pry further that night. As the days stretched on, Evon became increasingly aware that Igor was withdrawing from her. Although their evenings still contained tender moments, she caught glimpses of him walking alone in the corridors at odd hours, brow furrowed with worry. He grew silent, often staring off into space as if haunted by something she could not see. When she asked if anything was wrong, he would offer her a fleeting smile and insist he was fine, but she noticed his arms around her felt more hesitant, as if he feared crushing her beneath an invisible weight. When she woke in the middle of the night, she found his side of the bed cold. She would roam the estate searching, only to discover him alone in the library with a single candle burning, or standing in the courtyard with eyes fixed on the moon. Each time, he spoke little and returned to bed with her in silence. A week later, she confronted him by the fireplace in the main hall, where a gentle fire crackled, illuminating the room with warm orange light. "Igor," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I know something is bothering you. You don't have to hide it." He looked away. "I'm not hiding anything," he muttered. She swallowed hard, trying to contain the wave of frustration building within her. "You promised to share everything with me," she reminded him. "I can see that something weighs on you. Lilith is gone, so what could be so terrible that you can't tell me?" He pressed his lips together, tension visible in every line of his posture. Instead of answering her, he only shook his head and left the room, leaving Evon standing alone, anger and worry swirling in equal measure. She decided to give him space, hoping he would open up in his own time. But nights passed, and he grew only more distant. Gone were the playful exchanges and the gentle laughter that had lit the estate in the days following their victory over Lilith. In their place, a heavy silence stretched between them. Evon sensed that he was afraid of something, but she couldn't begin to guess what. He had faced ancient vampires without flinching. He had risked his life to save her from Lilith's clutches. What could possibly scare him more than that? Late one evening, she found him in the corridor outside his private study, staring at a centuries-old painting of a woman with pale eyes and flowing ebony hair. He stood so still that he might have been part of the artwork himself. "Igor," Evon said, her voice trembling with concern. "Who is she?" He took a step back, as though her question had struck him physically. "Her name is not important," he replied, jaw tight. She studied the painting, noticing something in the woman's expression that disturbed her. There was a sadness in those eyes, or perhaps fury, she could not quite tell. "Please talk to me." She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Not now," he said, nearly turning his back on her. "Evan, trust me when I say you're better off not knowing." Her heart sank. It was the first time she felt truly shut out by him, and it stung worse than any wound. She squared her shoulders and spoke with quiet determination. "If it matters to you, it matters to me," she insisted. "I love you. We're supposed to face everything together, remember?" He closed his eyes, drew a long breath, and then gently brushed past her, leaving Evan feeling colder than she had in a long while. Days later, her confusion and desperation reached a boiling point. She waited until dusk, when the estate glowed with the light of hundreds of candles, casting flickering shadows through the halls. She found Igor in his study, standing near an ornate desk piled with old tomes and ledgers. He barely glanced up as she entered, but she saw the flicker of conflict in his eyes. She shut the door behind her, heart pounding. "Enough," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't do this anymore. I don't understand why you're pushing me away, but you're hurting me, Igor." He looked down at the desk, his hands balled into fists. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She moved closer, tears threatening to spill. "Then tell me why," she demanded. "Tell me what's changed, because I don't believe for a moment that you just stopped loving me." He gritted his teeth. "I could never stop loving you," he snapped, a tremor in his voice. "That's the problem. Don't you see?" Her chest tightened. "No, I don't. Explain it to me." For a moment she thought he might walk away again, but he suddenly grabbed a dusty, leather-bound journal from the desk and thrust it at her. "Read it," he said hoarsely. She opened it, hands trembling, scanning handwritten entries from a distant century. She pieced together the story of another woman whom Igor had once loved. The words were filled with devotion at first, detailing moments of tenderness and vows of eternity. Then she read the lines describing betrayal, heartbreak, and a final oath made in blood, a curse bestowed upon Igor, ensuring that any mortal woman he dared to care for would perish in unimaginable pain. She raised her eyes, tears blurring her vision. "This is real?" Igor nodded, face contorted with guilt. "As real as anything else in my long life. She was the first woman I opened my heart to after centuries of isolation. I trusted her, but she was a sorceress of sorts, dabbling in dark arts. When she discovered I would not turn her into a vampire, she became enraged. She promised to destroy everything I loved." He swallowed hard. "The words of her curse are etched into my mind. Every mortal you dare cherish will know torment beyond imagining. I thought she'd be satisfied with just threatening me, but she wasn't. The first time I attempted to love again, the woman died in my arms without explanation. I realized then the curse was real." Evon's breath caught in her throat. "Why didn't you tell me?" He closed his eyes. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. At first I was so happy that you were here, alive, wanting me despite what I am. I foolishly believed maybe it wouldn't happen. Maybe my curse ended with Lilith's downfall. But after everything, I can feel it hanging over us. I sense the darkness gathering, waiting to claim you, and I would rather push you away and keep you at a distance than allow that curse to take your life." She reached for him, but he recoiled as if her touch burned. "Don't," he said roughly. "I can't risk it any longer, Evon. I've survived centuries alone. I'll do it again, if it keeps you safe." She let out a soft sob, grabbing him by the lapels of his coat, forcing him to face her. "No, you won't. We'll figure this out together. I'm not afraid." He hung his head, voice breaking. "You should be." She turned her face up to his, tears shining on her cheeks. "I'm more afraid of losing you than any curse." His eyes glistened, but he tore himself away from her. "Don't say that. I won't condemn you to the horror I know is lurking. This is not about me anymore. It's about you, and I won't risk your life." With that, he strode past her, vanishing into the dimly lit corridor. Evon stood there a long time, tears streaking her face as she clutched the old journal to her chest. That night she barely slept. She pored over every page of the journal, analyzing every scribbled line and cryptic note. It mentioned the name of the sorceress, Amara, and the small village where Igor had once lived with her centuries ago. She read of the unholy rituals that fueled Amara's power, of the vile oaths she swore under the light of a blood-red moon. Evon's heart pounded as she realized that the only chance they had to break the curse might lie with the very place it was born. She made up her mind, though it pained her to do it in secret. She would go there alone if that was what it took to free him from the curse. She scribbled a quick note, promising Igor she would return, but omitting her destination in case he tried to stop her. With trembling hands, she packed a small satchel, took one last look at the darkened corridors, and slipped away just before dawn. When Igor discovered her absence the following day, his fury shook the estate. He ripped through every room, demanding to know where she had gone. The guards and staff cowered at the sight of their king's wrath, but no one could answer. Eventually, he found the note tucked under an empty wine glass on the side table in their room. It read simply, "I love you. I will set you free. Trust me." He sank onto the edge of the bed, crushing the note in his hand, anger and dread warring within him. "You foolish, brave woman," he muttered, heart clenching at the thought of her wandering alone into unknown territory. Meanwhile, Evon traveled through mist-shrouded forests and over rugged hills, guided only by the scribbled references in Igor's journal. She kept her cloak tightly wrapped around her, the damp chill of morning clinging to her bones. Memories of her old life surfaced at unexpected moments. She recalled sleeping in abandoned buildings, always alone, always running. Now she had a purpose far greater than her own survival. If she could lift the curse, Igor would be free to love without fear. She followed a faint trail, leading to an abandoned hamlet where half-collapsed cottages stood like silent sentinels of a bygone era. Her journey brought her to a sprawling ruin of what must have once been a grand estate. The stone walls bore strange markings that reminded her of the final pages in Igor's journal, symbols that exuded malevolent energy. She fought a surge of panic, reminding herself that she was no longer the frightened woman she once had been. She had faced vampires and emerged stronger. She had defied Lilith herself and survived. A curse could not stop her. Carefully, she explored the rotted doorways, her footsteps echoing in the damp gloom. She found a large hall lined with crumbling columns, the floor covered in debris. At the far end, a gnarled altar stood, etched with runes identical to those described in the journal. As she approached, her chest tightened with foreboding. The air was deathly cold, and she felt a presence, like a pair of eyes watching from the shadows. A soft voice laced with centuries of bitterness drifted through the chamber. "How curious. Another mortal dares set foot here." Evon's spine tingled. She turned to see a spectral figure, translucent but unmistakably female, with flowing dark hair and a face twisted by sorrow and rage. "Amara," Evon whispered, recognizing her at once from the painting's resemblance. Amara moved closer, her form flickering. "You speak my name with surprising boldness. Who are you?" Evon lifted her chin. "I am Evon. I came here to end your curse on Igor." Amara's ghostly eyes widened. "Ah, Igor. So he found another plaything." Her tone dripped with scorn. "Tell me, mortal, do you really think you can break what I have wrought?" Despite the fear coursing through her veins, Evon refused to back down. I don't just think it. I know it. Because I love him. Amara let out a hollow laugh. Love. Such a delicate, trivial thing. She drifted in a slow circle around Evon. He once claimed to love me, but he refused to grant my wish to share his immortality. He dared to reject me, so I cursed him to spend eternity alone. You used your magic out of spite, Evon said, voice trembling with anger. Igor might have hurt you, but this was never justice. You damned countless innocent souls. The specter's face darkened, wisps of her hair swirling around her like snakes. Innocent? All the women who vied for his attention, who tried to take him away from me, were no innocents. I wanted them to suffer as I did. Evon planted her feet, stealing her resolve. You made a choice out of hatred, and now you let it linger even beyond your death. Amara flickered, rage flaring in her ghostly features. What do you think you can do about it, mortal? Evon swallowed back a swell of nerves. I'm here to end the curse, tell me how. The spirit hissed, fading for a moment before reappearing closer than ever, her lips curled into a cruel smile. End the curse? Child, you can't. Not without paying a price even you might find too steep. Evon's mind spun with recollections of the dark rituals described in Igor's journal. She took a shaky breath, forcing strength into her voice. I'll pay it if I must. There is nothing I won't do to save him. Amara studied her, eyes narrowing. For a moment her expression shifted, and the ghost of a wounded woman seemed to peer out from behind the hate. Why would you risk your life for his? Evon's voice cracked. Because he is worth it. I love him, and I would give up everything to break his chains. A silence hung in the air, broken only by the drip of water from a cracked ceiling. Then Amara's features twisted again, her bitterness returning. Foolish devotion. Very well. If you want to break my curse, you must find the place where blood and vow once mingled. Spill your own blood there, willingly, and you will draw me to you. Defeat my hatred with a greater power, if you can. But if you fail, you will share the fate of those who came before you. Evon swallowed hard. She knew the place, the altar behind her where the runes glowed faintly in the darkness. Her mind returned to the journal's last pages, which suggested the curse could only be undone where it had been first cast. Gathering every shred of courage, she moved to the altar, feeling the cold energy pulse beneath her palm. Meanwhile, Igor tore through the wilderness like a storm. The moment he had read Evon's note, he had gathered what fragments of knowledge remained about Amara's domain. He realized exactly where Evon must have gone, and the thought of her confronting that malevolent spirit alone racked him with terror. He had lost too many people in his life already. If he lost Evon too, it would destroy him. Pushing himself to the limits of his vampiric speed, he raced against the rising sun to the old hamlet, following her faint trail through the mist. Inside the ancient hall, Evon drew a small blade, her hand shaking. All right, she murmured, more to herself than to the specter hovering nearby. I'll do this for him, for us. She pressed the blade to her palm, wincing as it cut deep. Blood trickled down her wrist, spattering across the runes. A palpable energy crackled in the air, and Amara's spectral form flared brighter. Amara's voice filled the chamber, echoing with otherworldly power. You give your blood willingly. So be it. Evon felt a surge of cold around her, as if invisible tendrils were trying to pull her down. She clenched her jaw, holding on to a single thought. Igor's face, the warmth in his eyes when he smiled at her, the tenderness of his kiss. I will not fail, she whispered. Suddenly the doors to the hall slammed open. Igor burst in, his coat soaked from the relentless rain, his expression one of frantic desperation. Evon, he roared, voice echoing. He spotted her by the altar, blood dripping from her hand, and his eyes widened with horror. What are you doing? She turned to him, tears on her cheeks. It's the only way, she said, voice trembling. I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer, afraid to love me because of this curse. He sprinted to her side. You should have told me, he said, his tone raw with fear. I wouldn't have let you do this alone. Before he could pull her away, Amara's voice rang out, shaking the walls. Too late, Igor. The ritual has begun. The spirit's form flared into full visibility, her face contorted with madness. You will watch her die for your arrogance. Igor snarled, placing himself protectively in front of Evon. Number, I won't lose her to your twisted vengeance. Amara shrieked, and the runes glowed a blood-red hue. Shadows coalesced in the corners of the hall, forming inky shapes that writhed with malicious intent. Igor realized they were manifestations of Amara's wrath, centuries of hatred given shape. They lunged at him and Evon. Igor fought them off with inhuman speed, hurling them away, but each time they reassembled, drawn by the power of the curse. Evon clutched at his arm, her face pale but resolute. We have to finish this, she gasped. Somehow, we have to show her that our love is stronger than her hatred. He gritted his teeth. How? Her eyes shone with a fierce determination. Trust me. That's what you said in your note, right? Trust me now. She broke away from him before he could protest. Blood still seeped from her hand as she faced Amara's furious specter head-on. You did this because you were hurt, Evon said, voice echoing through the hall. You felt betrayed and abandoned, so you damned him to eternal loneliness. But Igor is not the heartless monster you make him out to be. He's a man who has learned to love again, despite centuries of pain. That love is stronger than your curse. Amara's laughter filled the air, trembling with anger. Stronger? Do you think your mortal heart can defeat centuries of torment? The shadows surged again, but Evon stood her ground, ignoring the chill skittering over her skin. Igor fought off the swirling figures, launching them back with supernatural force. I believe in her, he hissed under his breath, clearing a path so that Evon could continue. Evon took a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry for what happened to you, but you have to let go. This curse binds us all in misery. None of us can move on until it's broken. She held up her bleeding palm, the drops of blood sizzling on the rune-engraved stone. I offer my life in place of his. If that is what it takes to break your hold, then so be it. But know this. I give it willingly out of love, not out of fear. The spirit of Amara flickered, an unreadable expression flashing across her face. For a moment, it looked almost like sorrow. You would die for him? Evon nodded, voice trembling yet certain. Yes. Igor roared, No! As he flung away a looming shadow, desperation blazing in his eyes. That's not the price we want to pay. Take my blood, take my life, anything. Just spare her. Amara's gaze raked over them both. So much devotion, she murmured, her once malevolent voice faltering, as though something inside her had cracked. It has been so long since I saw that between two souls. Her form wavered, flickering in and out like a dying flame. I never meant to become this. Time seemed to slow as the swirling shadows settled. The crimson runes glowed with a final surge of power, and Evon felt her knees threaten to buckle under the pressure. She had never felt such an oppressive force in her life, as though the walls of reality were caving in. She cried out, uncertain whether her voice was lost in the roar that filled her ears. Igor reached for her, catching her in his arms. I've got you, he whispered, his eyes brimming with love and fear. She pressed her hand over his chest, feeling his heartbeat thunder beneath. I'm here, she managed to say, breath ragged. I love you. A bright flash lit the hall, forcing both of them to shield their eyes. When it subsided, Amara stood before them, her spectral figure faint and trembling. I see, she said, tears shimmering in her translucent eyes. There is strength in you two that I never understood. Perhaps Perhaps I was the fool. Igor kept Evon behind him protectively. Are you ending this? He asked, voice tight with urgency. Amara let out a long, hollow sigh. I have lingered too long in bitterness. My curse was born from betrayal and heartbreak. But your love is genuine. The old magic that bound my anger. It cannot hold if I release it willingly. She lifted her hands, which glowed with the same red hue as the runes. I release this curse. Suddenly, a shimmering gust of wind swept through the hall, causing Evon's cloak to billow and Igor's hair to whip around his face. The runes on the altar turned from red to a pale gold, before fading altogether. The swirling shadows dissolved into nothingness. Amara's form began to dissolve as well, the edges of her silhouette drifting away like smoke. She turned sad eyes on Igor. I loved you once, and I wanted to keep you forever. I see now that love is not something to be taken by force. Igor bowed his head, a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow coloring his features. I'm sorry it ended like this, Amara. She smiled faintly, tears vanishing into the ether of her form. I am too. Farewell, Igor. May the love you have found bring you happiness. With that, she flickered one last time and vanished, leaving only silence and a few drifting motes of ethereal light in her wake. For a long moment, neither Evon nor Igor spoke. They stood together, breathing heavily as the oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a strange serenity. Evon, still unsteady from the ordeal, leaned against him. He wrapped her in his arms, pressing his face against her hair. You ended it, he whispered, voice thick with gratitude and awe. I can feel it's gone. The curse is gone. She gazed up at him, tears of relief streaming down her face. We ended it. She chose to let go, and you were right here with me, just like I knew you would be. He couldn't speak for a moment, only held her tighter, burying his face in her neck. I almost lost you. Again. His voice cracked, and she could feel his entire body shaking with emotion. I can never repay you for what you risked. She cradled his face in her palms, forcing him to meet her gaze. You owe me nothing except the truth and your love. I won't let you shut me out ever again. He nodded, lips trembling. Never again, he promised. He kissed her then, softly at first, as though still afraid she might dissolve in his arms. But the kiss deepened with every heartbeat, a tender urgency that spoke of a love now freed from centuries of fear. She tasted his tears, and he tasted hers. They clung to each other in the ruined hall, lit by the pale dawn filtering through the broken roof. When they finally parted, breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. Let's go home, he whispered. She smiled through her tears. Yes, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Home. They left the ancient estate hand in hand, stepping into the daylight with a renewed sense of hope. Though the journey was tiring, they moved as if weightless, unburdened by the darkness that once loomed over them. Igor held her close, not wanting to waste another second without being near her. She felt his heart beating, and it was strong and steady, no longer haunted. Back at Igor's ancestral home, the silence that greeted them felt peaceful instead of tense. The corridor seemed warmer, and the staff who had feared Igor's wrath just days ago now saw a softness in their king's expression. Evon let out a shaky laugh the moment they stepped inside. I can't believe it, she said, voice still laced with disbelief. It's really over. He turned her to face him, gazing deep into her eyes. It's over because of your courage, he said. I will spend the rest of my days, my centuries, if you will let me, repaying that gift. She wrapped her arms around his waist. You already have, she whispered. All I ever wanted was your love, without fear or walls between us. He bent to kiss her again, slower this time, each movement of his lips speaking volumes of gratitude, affection, and promise. Their world felt new and bright, despite the ages he had lived and the trials she had endured. In that kiss lay all the words they had yet to say, a testament to the bond they had forged not just in passion, but in overcoming curses, ghosts, and mortal danger. They found solace in each other's arms that evening, lying on the same bed where only days before Igor had wondered if he would have to leave her for her own safety. Now there was no barrier left between them, no secret unspoken, no ancient threat lurking. The estate felt alive again with the hum of possibility, and as the night wore on, they talked quietly about the future. Igor promised to teach her more about his realm, about the vampiric powers he commanded, and about the hidden corners of the world she had never seen. Evon insisted on learning how to protect herself so that she would never be caught unaware again. They laughed together, imagining centuries of adventures side by side, unconstrained by any curse. Every so often he would stop mid-sentence, take her hand and press kisses to her palm, the one that had bled for him. She would smile, reminded of just how far they had come. Neither of them could predict what challenges might come next, but they knew now that their love could withstand even the greatest darkness. Just before dawn, Igor drew her against his chest, her head resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. "Thank you," he breathed. She tilted her face up. "For what?" He brushed his lips across her temple. "For showing me that love is stronger than any curse. For choosing me when you could have run. For giving me hope I didn't believe I deserved." She closed her eyes, letting the steady cadence of his heartbeat lull her. "I didn't do it alone. You were right there, fighting for me as much as I fought for you." He smiled, tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear. "From this moment on, we face everything together." She nodded, sleep tugging at her. "Together," she echoed, her voice soft as morning light began to creep through the curtains. Their final words that night were a quiet promise of devotion. In that promise, they found the strength of a love, free from the shackles of curses or haunted memories. They had emerged from darkness hand in hand, hearts entwined, ready to embrace the future with every breath they had. Igor watched as Evon finally drifted into a peaceful sleep, her features relaxed, her lips curved in the faintest smile. For centuries he had wandered alone, fearing every bond would lead to pain, but now, with the curse broken, he felt a wholeness in himself he hadn't known was possible. He closed his eyes, grateful beyond words that she had risked everything for him. A future without fear, a love not confined by ancient hatred. This was more than he had dared to dream. He pressed one more gentle kiss to her hair, then let his own exhaustion claim him, secure in the knowledge that when dawn came, they would stand side by side, together in a way they never truly could have been before. Morning light found them asleep in each other's arms, unafraid of what the day might bring. In that quiet moment, they lay like two souls fused into one, hearts beating in unison. And so began a new chapter of their journey, not only as king and consort, not only as vampire and mortal, but as lovers bound by a bond stronger than any curse. The halls of the estate would never again echo with the weight of unspoken fears or secret griefs. Instead, they would be filled with whispered vows, tender laughter, and the undeniable proof that love, once found, could shatter even the darkest of spells.